This is just another edition to the Beyond the Field series, where we're talking tonight specifically about more of the same, the lack of diversity in sport leadership, where we're going to explore what is contributing to the lack of diversity in sport leadership organizations. Before I introduce our guests, I do want to quickly thank our partners, including the Neag School of Education. They have been an immense help with some of the technical side, as well as housing a lot of our information. And we're also found the UConn Sport Management Program is housed within the Neag School of Education. I'd also want to thank the Dodd Center, who has also been a really great partner over a number of years now, providing space, including this virtual space tonight. So the reason we're able to have this on Zoom is because of them. So thank you to those two partners. We encourage our audience to participate using the Q&A function that's going to be located at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions for our panelists, please at any time you can ask those questions there, and we'll do our best to integrate those into the conversation. And specifically at the end of the session, we're going to use those questions in the Q&A to talk to our panelists. Just as one programming note, Chaim Bloom is with us this evening, and he needs to step away at roughly 7:30 for some, obviously, not too important issues going on over with the Red Sox, but yes, he needs to step away. So what we're going to do is we're going to have him speak a little bit more at the beginning. And then if you have any questions, try to have those questions asked around the 7:20 mark so we can integrate them and ask them for Chaim before he takes off. But without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists this evening. So we have Dr. Richard Lapchick from UCS, DeVos College of Business. Dr. Lapchick is a human rights activist, pioneer for racial equality, internationally recognized expert on sport issues, and is a scholar and author. Dr. Lapchick is often described as the racial conscious of sport, and he became the only person named as one of the 100 most powerful people in sport to head up a sport management program. Dr. Lapchick, thank you for being here tonight. We also have Chaim Bloom, as previously mentioned. He is the current chief baseball officer for the Boston Red Sox. He previously worked for the Tampa Bay Rays and as the senior vice president of baseball operations. And he also oversaw the hiring of Bianca Smith, who's the first Black female coach in Major League Baseball. Chaim, thanks for being here this evening.
Thanks for having me.
We also have our very own Doug Glanville. He's a former Major League Baseball player who since has used his experience and voice to bring life to human stories as they intersect with baseball and beyond. He writes extensively for The Atlantic, ESPN, is a frequent contributor of ESPN's Baseball Tonight, and he's also an instructor for our sport management program. So Doug, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. And lastly, we have Ajhanai Newton, who again is one of our own. She's currently a Ph.D. candidate in her 4th year here at UConn and is an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion in sport organizations. Ajhanai focuses on the adoption of diversity and inclusion officers in sport organizations, their role and the organizational structures, empowering and constraining their efforts. Ajhanai, thanks for being here as a panelist tonight, normally as a host, but thanks for being here as a panelist.
I'm on the other side, so I'm very excited.
Awesome. Right. Well, we're going to just jump right into it. And so yet again, we're faced with an off season and primarily the NFL and MLB, where major headlines were being made regarding the race and gender of those hired into leadership positions. In some regards, we are seeing advances being made, and in others, there appears to be stagnation and even regression in terms of there being a diverse workforce within sport organizations. So I want to open this conversation up. Dr. Lapchick, if you don't mind taking a couple of minutes to tell us, what do we mean by diversity or a diverse workforce when we're talking about that particular buzzword?
Well, the news stories around what you're talking about have particularly focused on general managers and head coaches, which are the two positions that we generally look at most in the racial and gender report cards that we do. I wrote a column this weekend called Diversity Wins about the Tampa Bay Bucks and how they won the Super Bowl. And they had the only team with 4 Black head coordinators, as well as 2 women on the coaching staff. Obviously, Kansas City had the offensive coordinator who's most likely to be hired as a head coach. None of them were. Most of them weren't even interviewed, but there were the Tampa Bay Bucks winning the championship. And Bruce Arians ascribed that victory after the game and leading up to the game, them getting there, to the fact that he had these brilliant minds on his staff, and he actually expressed anger that they weren't getting those coaching interviews. And Eric Bieniemy obviously has been out there for 2 years as a lead candidate and still has not had an offer. This is, from my point of view, a function of who owns those teams. We have a group of older white men, older, wealthy, super wealthy white men, who this past year in the political campaign donated $5.9 million to the two parties. And it's no coincidence in my mind that $5 million went to the Republicans and only $900,000 to the Democrats, kind of laying out their political philosophies to some degree. And I think that's a major factor that we haven't had those big changes. I think the NFL put in some policies this year between 2020 and 2021 that strengthened the Rooney Rule, that had top assistant coaches in the public eye so that they would be recognized, they would be household names. And they really expected, I think, that it would have been a different outcome at the end of the year. And we even had a Houston star quarterback saying he wasn't going to play in Houston anymore because of their inability or unwillingness, from his point of view, to hire a black coach. I have to wonder if in the end they didn't hire that black coach as a consequence of fear of losing him. That's, of course, speculation, but the rest of it isn't speculation.
Thank you for that. I'm actually going to push it over to Chaim now, because as someone who's in a front office and has been involved in making hiring decisions, what are the conversations that you're having in your experience when it comes to discussing the diversity of candidate pools and who you're looking at to take on these sort of manager and leadership positions?
Yeah, I think, it's a positive thing that I think these conversations are changing in our industry, but it just shines a light on the fact that there's so much need for change, and there has been a need for change. And I really think, what you have largely in our industry, and our sport is one where I think you also see this issue with the players on the field. That's maybe a separate issue and not what you're asking about. But, it happens that when you're talking about people in chairs like mine, you are dealing with an overwhelmingly white, though no longer exclusively male group. And I think in that group, you have people who are very well-intentioned, who would consider themselves to be progressive, who would consider themselves to be pro-diversity, almost, if not entirely to a person. But I would say as a group, we are still not aware enough of a lot of the roadblocks and a lot of the biases that are hidden to us because we are in the majority, that exists for people in the minority, the subtle cues that might tell people that this isn't for them, this is not their game, that we need to do a better job of removing. I do think we've become better at looking at the demographics of our candidate pool. But until we have to take that extra step and be really proactive in recognizing what are those things that are making it harder for people who are underrepresented in our game to get in. And that's going to take some proactive steps to wipe away. And those conversations are happening now, I think, in the past 2, 3, 4 years in ways that they didn't previously. But it just highlights the need for those conversations, frankly, and shows that we still have a long way to go.
I'm going to actually push it over to Doug now, because Doug, you recently wrote an article kind of discussing some of the factors that go into your own decision making. And I would just love for you to kind of articulate that a little bit.
Well, I wrote this article for ESPN.com recently, and it's kind of inspired a little bit of what happened at our Capitol, on January 6th, and I started to just reflect on some things. And I think for me, that was a crystallizing moment where I looked at it almost as a parent, and all these amazing opportunities and these discussions, as Chaim and Dr. Lapchick mentioned, about these organizations really starting to think about how they can change this culture. And for me, what was tough was thinking, am I going to, take a job as a manager, let's say, and be on the road in an environment right now where I feel there's so much threat around race. And I think that, was something that I weigh. So it's one thing to say, okay, you're a Black candidate and you can be interviewed. And maybe to some degree, there's a sort of a victory in checking a box and saying, okay, we're open to diversity. I think it's another thing to understand what it means to actually live in that box. And just something simple like this. Let's say I take a job with a team. I'm going to weigh, with my family coming with me, I'm going to weigh the school system. I'm going to weigh if it's a neighborhood where I can live. And these are weighty decisions. I mean, what is the policing like in that neighborhood? Can I jog in my neighborhood? These aren't really straightforward. What we can take for granted as this mundane decision making is not really simple when you overlay race. So I wrote about a lot to do with that history. As Dr. Lapchick mentioned, there's policy like the Rooney Rule that was put in place to encourage or really mandate in some degree the interview of diverse candidates. Baseball has the Selig Rule. But even in the beginning iteration of the Selig Rule, there was a complete shift in how experience or qualifications were defined. And it shifted away from what was, back in the day, we're saying you got to go to the minor leagues, you got to go to winter ball, you got to do these things. And it became a little more of a lateral apprenticeship where there was a little bit more handpicking or grooming under a certain philosophy. And once that candidate was ready, they didn't require that traditional experience. They would move laterally. And I think what was understandable about any industry evolving is one thing, but what was frustrating is seeing that didn't necessarily overlap in terms of creating diversity. If you open the door and say, all right, we don't really need these traditional experience markers that used to create this homogeneity in our candidacy, then you would think that would open up more diversity. But there was a period where it actually went the other way. And once again, I don't necessarily espouse that it's all nefarious or all, but I do think that there's a comfort when you have a certain power that you can reinforce it and concentrate it amongst itself, and the candidates can reflect that. So I think I was trying to express that these are heavy decisions, and it's more than just, hey, I could break the color line, I can do these things. I'm weighing all these other components to it that I think these games, these organizations have to really start to consider. What else do these candidates weigh? Because that will help you interview these candidates and really think about gaining that competency around culturally around how to make not only these changes, but make people feel welcome.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate that. And there's a couple of things there that I want us to get into. I think that you kind of started to mention this in terms of what is the experience needed for an individual to be able to obtain one of these positions. And I often hear this language around best fit for the organization. And so, Ajhanai, I just want to hear your thoughts and hear what you think about when you hear that word or that coded language. And it was what I think is around best fit. And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think we hear that term thrown around a lot in organizations, particularly when we're talking about hiring, but the best fit, as we have seen, leads to certain types of individuals. And so I think if we take a step back and really think about the best fit for whom and for what organizational goals, for what aims, particularly when you're thinking about, the networks of who the best fit candidate is coming from, we understand that these networks are saturated in terms of gender disparities, in terms of racial disparities. We also understand that, we can have historically racialized minorities be successful in positions, but that doesn't necessarily lead them to be perceived as the best fit. And I think we have to understand why, and also retract that language and really think more critically about what we mean from an organizational perspective. I think we can turn to the recent example of Chris Doyle from Iowa University, who was just hired by Urban Meyer into the best fit position that Urban Meyer was thinking. But when I say for whom and for what, the NFL has a platform of now trying to alter their image about racial justice. So you hire a strength and conditioning coach who was just recently fired for bullying and harassing Black players. And so you thought that was the best fit for this environment. And so I think as everyone has alluded to that there's biases in this language, but there's also biases that privy certain groups, and we understand who those groups are and in what leadership positions. Additionally, I think we also need to consider how best fit has been related to comfort levels. And so hiring within our networks, not taking opportunities or candidates outside of our networks. There was a recent article, I know, Charles, you and I were trying to find it. We just saw it on Twitter, where we saw how rife nepotism is in the NFL. And I think if we also looked at collegiate athletics, particularly in football, we would see that nepotism play out as well. And so best fit doesn't always mean the person who is the most competent for the position. We're also thinking about the comfort level that whoever hiring is comfortable with, and that person is the best fit. And we could think about homogeneity in that as well.
Hey, Ajhanai, I appreciate that. And so, Chaim, again, I want to bring it back to you as a person who's in these front offices and having to make these decisions. You know, one, there is like, you want to tap into the network, the people you know, you've seen them maybe do what they need to do to be successful at their job, and you trust them. You're also wanting to diversify the candidate pool. And now we have Doug laying on this extra layer here where he's thinking about, well, what about this organization? You know, what about the community this organization is located in? Am I going to be safe? And are you hearing that amongst other individuals when you're thinking about hiring on these individuals? Or and what are you doing in the organization to make people feel heard, feel seen, and feel included?
Yeah, this is an especially pointed question for the Red Sox, because our history over, you know, the long haul of this organization surrounding race is frankly shameful. And that's not news. That's something that, you know, to their credit, our owners, since taking over the club, have been very open about and wanting and tried to be proactive to take steps to reverse that. Or, you know, you can't reverse it, but at least to be aware of it and to push back against it. We also know, and I actually found out about this shortly after joining the organization. There was an incident a number of years ago, and I'm sure there's dozens and dozens of similar incidents that didn't get publicized, but very public situation with Adam Jones, a black outfielder who, you know, racial slurs were being screamed at him from the stands, and it became a very public thing. And I think it led to, you know, some, like, now it is written in the policies of the organization that if you do that as a fan in Fenway Park, you are banned for life. But here, for me, it was kind of hearing after that incident happened, and the organization was very, I think, forward about saying this happened. Even recently, actually, the organization had to come out again and say, you know, I think it was in response to some things that Torrey Hunter had cited about what it's like to play at Fenway, that this is real, because there are people who doubt that this happens. They just say, no, this can't be. And after this came to light, I heard this, you know, this happened before I joined the organization. There were a number of Black Day of Game workers, the organization, that came forward and said, I hear that word every day I work from somebody, which, you know, it is not surprising, but it is shocking. And it was shocking to me as a newcomer to the organization in this day and age to hear that. And it is a reputation, deservedly so, that I think our community carries. And I think the organization within the walls, I believe, you know, it is doing things to change that, doing things to have an inclusive environment. We got so much farther to go, and there's a lot of initiatives currently that are in development. We are, I think, fairly well represented in leadership with, you know, both women, people of color, and so forth. But, you know, some of the things that Doug talked about, when we just did a managerial search process, and I haven't confirmed any of the names of the candidates that we did not hire, except for Will Venable, who subsequently joined us as our bench coach. I wonder what's going through their heads when they think about what it would be like to be in this job, potentially as a first-time manager in a town as crazy as Boston, and knowing the history. And, you know, you wonder what goes through the heads of those candidates, and what it would be like to need to support them in the face of that and give them extra support, knowing that that's just going to add to the stress level. And I think, Doug, what you alluded to, or actually said outright, those are the types of things I was talking about, these barriers that may be invisible to people in the majority. I didn't have to think about that when deciding whether or not I should move to Boston and accept this job. And these are stressful jobs. Being a major league manager is a stressful job. Being a major league coach is a stressful job. And at some point you pile on all these other stressors, and it's an uphill battle for, you know, people who are not in like the majority demographic in this business. And that's a perfect example of something that you're not going to think about if you are me, because you don't have to think about it. Doug, you don't have a choice whether to think about that or not, because it's real for you. And, you know, that's, I think, the privilege that we who are in that majority demographic have of not having to think about it. So what does that mean as leaders? We have a responsibility to choose to think about it and to try to put ourselves in those shoes, although we can't fully, and to say, okay, if I were in those shoes, what would I need done for me to make this as easy as possible, knowing we can't change the world in one day, but what can we do to do our part to change the world?
I'm going to take that opportunity to actually shift it to Dr. Lapchick here, who I know has extensive experience consulting and writing and doing this type of work. Before that, though, I am mindful of time. It is 7:22. So if anyone does have any questions specifically for Chaim, please pop them into the Q&A box now. But Dr. Lapchick, you know, Chaim alluded to is not just the players, it's not just the managers, it's game day operations staff who are experiencing issues of racism and hatred. It's individuals who are in the front office who are often, you know, in the minority in terms of like there may be only one or two other individuals who share an identity as they do. What are some of the strategies or things that organizations can do to create that inclusive environment?
Well, you know, we publish a lot of statistics and numbers about how we need to change those numbers, but I always try to emphasize that it's not just about changing the numbers, it's about changing the atmosphere on the team, the attitudes of what they're going to move into if they do hire a person of color or a woman. I speak on probably 25 college campuses a year, and I'm always picked up at the airport by the senior African-American or the senior woman on the athletic department staff or the president's staff. And the conversation on the way to the hotel or wherever they're taking me is, what a wonderful place this is to raise my children. I really enjoyed it here. I've been here 6 years, whatever. And, you know, what you and your listeners probably don't know is I don't consider myself an academic. I consider myself an activist. And in 1978, I was the victim of an attack as the leader of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, and had liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, concussion, and had the N-word carved in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. And people at the time said to me, well, now you understand what it's like to be Black. And I said in 1978, and I say to you tonight, I don't understand what it's like to be Black. I can walk away from this at any moment and never face discrimination or violence again. If I'm Black, I'm going to wake up Black tomorrow and face violence or discrimination every day of my life. Hopefully it's not going to happen, but it's always possible that it would happen. And, you know, this is the type of thing that we have to listen and learn. And so to change those attitudes, I'm a firm advocate of doing diversity and inclusion training extensively with every organization. It has been something that had kind of fallen by the wayside in recent years. We've been doing it for more than 30 years. But now in the wake of the racial reckoning, there's a demand for it. And I think I listen to and meet with Black leaders, both in and out of sport, and they think white people are actually listening now to what it means to be a subject of an act of racism, not just that there is some form of racism, and to understand it's more than police brutality. It's about systemic racism that affects every part of life in America. And as that happens in an organization, Chaim and I will think about those things from the start, not have to have somebody nudge us in the shoulder and say, did you ever think about this?
I appreciate that. And I apologize for having to not be able to dive into that at this moment, but recognizing that Chaim's going to have to step off here in a second, I want to get to some of our attendees' questions here. And so I'm going to do my best to try and synthesize a number of questions, but it seems to be getting this general question around, do you feel pressure to hire individuals or, you know, to diversify the candidate pool? And what does that pressure look like? And how does that maybe affect, you know, where you see the organization going?
guess it depends what you mean by pressure. I mean, in terms of like, do I feel pressure externally? No, not any different than pressure I feel externally to succeed as an organization. I think this is one of those things where having a diverse environment and having an inclusive environment is perfectly aligned with all of our other goals. I actually think in our sport, and probably in most sports that are male dominated, for instance, we are not realizing the full benefit of, operationally how much better we would be if we had women represented better in our organization and in positions of authority. I think that applies for every underrepresented group. I really think, okay, to me, the business we're in is right now a race. You have to run really fast just to stand still operationally. And most of it happens behind the scenes that people don't see. They see the results on the field, but a lot of those results, the good results, come from years and years of, just kicking ass behind the scenes. And we're all trying to outdo each other in that regard. And that comes from having an open and fertile environment for thought and for innovation, for self-criticism, for just constantly moving forward and say, how can we be better? Well, it just stands to reason to me. There is, and I know there are studies in the business world that have supported this, to some degree. We're not going to be as good at that if all of us around the table are kind of the same and looking at the world the same way. And that's not just about race. It's not just about gender, but it's not going to happen the way we want it to happen if we do not have a diverse group in those respects. So any pressure I feel is just, both doing the right thing, but also I think this is going to help us outcompete our opponents.
I appreciate that. And if we have time just for one more question here, it would be, where do you see the Red Sox efforts going to making sure that you are getting that strong, diverse workforce, but also making sure that they are feeling included and feeling welcomed, kind of some of the things we've already touched on in terms of what Doug was discussing?
Yeah, that's something, frankly, I don't know that I have a perfect answer because, I've become aware over time that, just because, you can, again, think of yourself as a pro-diversity, progressive, forward-thinking person, and you don't even realize the things that you're missing because you have the luxury of missing them if you're in the majority. But I do think, the recruitment is one aspect of it. I think we're getting better at that. I actually think the Red Sox were early leaders in this. Leaders, it's all relative, right? But I do think we're doing more and more things to proactively expand our applicant pool to make sure we are saying to people who may look at this sport and say, this is not for me, to make sure they know it is. But then it's about the environment. And now what happens when a person like that comes into the organization? And I think we need to be, and we actually have had a lot of conversations about this, both around race and also around gender with some of the recent things the revelations in our sport about how women, both with clubs and then in the media, have been treated by some men in our sport, of making sure there have to be better pathways for people to speak up about anything large or small that may be hindering their progress in a way that they feel free from retaliation, even if it's implicit. And, you like to think you have some, but we need more. And we've had a lot of conversation about creating more.
I know you need to run to your next meeting here. Thank you for being here tonight, and and good luck this season.
Thank you so much. If this thing is quick, I will try to pop back in, but I'm not in control of the meeting, so no promises. But thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate your time. Thanks for bearing with my schedule.
Thank you. Take care. Dr. Lapchick, I want to go back to kind of what you were discussing earlier here. You described the experience of, in experiencing like that personal violence against yourself, right? And that is something that I think individuals who are in the minority coming into these organizations that are homogenous, do experience, right? They experience physical violence as well as that symbolic violence oftentimes. And so I want to kind of explore a little bit more of that symbolic violence that can occur where it's being set up for failure. And so, we've talked about the glass cliff and where the opportunities that are presented to individuals who are outside kind of the majority are set up, to take on an organization, to take on a team, and then they're just automatically going to fail within a couple of years because the organization sets them up to failure. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, what we've also seen historically is, particularly in the coaching ranks and managerial ranks, that Black head coaches have been given a shorter span to prove themselves. If they're not successful in a year or two, and they're typically taking over franchises that have been having bad records, so the likelihood of a quick turnaround is even less possible. They're out after 2 or 3 years. It's become shorter and shorter, whereas a white coach might get an extra couple of years. Black coaches almost never get rehired. They're out of the cycle once they're losing that first job. White coaches get hired and rehired so often. So there are things that happen that are patterns across the industry, and that's also true in college sport, unfortunately. There's also obviously a gender factor here. One of the most disturbing statistics to me that we report every year is that across all 3 college divisions, the head coaches of women's teams, 60% of the head coaches of women's teams are men. 50% of the assistant coaches of women's teams are men across all 3 divisions. When I go to a college campus and I ask an athletic director, would you hire a woman to coach a men's team? They look at me like, we heard you were crazy, Lapchick, but now we know you are. We just don't hire women in any number to coach men's teams. We don't think about hiring a man to coach a woman's team. These are just some of the factors that are out there that are serious obstacles to making a difference and moving ahead. I think the game changer is going to be athlete activism. I think that when Colin Kaepernick took a knee in 2016, I think that most of the American public disapproved of it. You've probably seen in a recent Nielsen survey of sports fans in America that 77% of sports fans now support athlete activism. 78% support their teams supporting the athletes, and 80% want their brands to become active in social justice issues. That's a huge shift of the sports fans' public opinion. And I think as we hear athletes turn their attention, as they were so impactful with the whole Black Lives Matter movement in the past year, as they turn their attention inward to their athletic departments, if they're student athletes, to their teams, if they're players in an organization, that we're going to see that impact felt much more quickly than we have historically after all these years of waiting for the tide to change.
I think that's a great point. And Ajhanai, I'm going to kind of hear your voice on this. With the athlete activism, and we've talked quite a bit about this, there is the fear that what these organizations are doing is performative, right? They are doing something outward facing to make it look like they are supporting these issues. Internally, are we seeing that happen? Are we seeing individuals, who are affected by some of these issues in our society getting the support they need in the organizations to be successful? And if not, what should these organizations really be doing to live the things that they're espousing?
Yeah, great question. I just want to pivot back to the data to what Dr. Lapchick was alluding to. When we're looking at the FBS level, there have only been 4 Black head coaches that have been rehired at the FBS level. And so when we're talking back again to organizational culture, there's a basic assumption there, one of the tenets of organizational culture, that Black coaches don't get a second chance. And so if you are a racial minority and you're walking into a position and you have that burden already placed on you, it's already a different expectation. It's already a different experience, particularly for those who are walking the bounds of multiple marginalized identities. I know Doug spoke to earlier the things he's considering, with location and moving, but we also have to think about how there are potential candidates who aren't just thinking about their racial identity or their gender identity, but also their sexual orientation. And so there's a lot of processing here and interpretation that has to take place, particularly around, again, what organizational culture is. And I know in sport, we throw around culture a lot and we say we need a good culture, but if we really break it down, we're looking at values, artifacts, and underlying assumptions. And if those are rooted in a historicality that has been, one, not about promoting inclusion and really not about diversity, to think that you're just going to have this pivot all of a sudden. For those of us who are critical of sport organizations, we have to take a pause and really think like, well, where did this pivot start? For me this summer, seeing the wave of athlete activism disrupt collegiate athletics, and to see so many statements of support for Black Lives Matter pop up to me almost out of nowhere, when Black Lives Matter has been a movement since 2013, and we're now having predominantly white institutions, white coaches now hop on board. It was a moment where I had to think about how symbolic is this and how substantive is it? Is this now the move because it's legitimate and it makes your athletic department seem legitimate, meaning proper and appropriate? Is it now putting you in a better financial positioning? Are you now just silencing voices because you're now hopping on board with athlete activism and racial justice and gender equity? And so it's hard as an academic, as a researcher, to truly know sometimes what's going on in these organizations that we want to study due to issues of access. But unfortunately, we get the big news when the story drops. And so we saw what happened with the Washington team this summer. We saw what happened with Michigan State University. And so we saw what happened with the Iowa State football players. And so we continue to have these moments where we get a glimpse into organizational context and how values, artifacts, and assumptions are manifesting to then recreate an interpretive process of discrimination. And so part of my work has been really and the work that I know we're working on together, is to really think about how is athlete activism in some way leading to institutional change, and not just change for the moment, but change that's disrupting sport and sport entities in totality, and not just select organizations.
Thank you, Ajhanai. I mean, you just dropped a lot right there. And so one thing I want to kind of go back to is that, there are individuals need to wade through and make sense of the decisions and actions that organizations are taking, right? Is this just something that is performative, or are they actually making those internal changes to make sure that they're supporting individuals, right? If they have this whole history and legacy of not supporting individuals or who, from different backgrounds, and why am I to believe that all of a sudden that, they have changed? And so, Doug, I know you've been in that position where you're assessing an organization as much as they're assessing you. How do you do that? How do you make sense of that in terms of figuring out whether this is where you want to be?
It's tough because there is sometimes a pressure because, for example, like I could be that candidate, right? It's like, oh, well, we have, this movement in baseball, you see, sort of the Ivy League pedigree with the analytics, the former ball player, no managerial experience beforehand. So I could check those boxes. And I think it turns it a little bit on its head to say that there's still aspects that I'm sensitive to around identity that they still have to address for this to be a viable opportunity. And to some degree that can shock, is like, wait a minute, we're giving you this job. And I think when it's perceived in this charitable, gift-giving power position, that can create problems too, because, like you mentioned before, are you just checking a box? Are you just interviewing me because you're supposed to? I mean, I interviewed with Chaim Bloom when he was with the Rays, and I appreciated his forward thinking. That was probably the most diverse group of candidates probably in the history up until that time. He really cared about the issue. But I know that the layers to it for me is, weighing that, okay, my identity is going to play a role in how I engage society. I'm going to pay attention to the commitment of these organizations. So when you talk about performative, we often struggle with the fact we don't have the luxury of time sometimes. And that's the challenge. These changes, no matter how intense, have this protracted nature to them. So if you're going to make a wholesale change, say the Boston Red Sox, do we as a society have a certain patience to be able to see if this has actually been embedded, or is it something that's going to blow away with the wind? And it's very hard to judge that in real time. And I'm sure Dr. Lapchick could shine a light on what he's seen that actually sustains versus, what is actually performative or feels good in the moment. And I know with his Tide studies, for example, I always wonder about, okay, there's one thing to be in that chair and say, as I call color by numbers, you have the numbers, but behind those layers are, well, how fast do people advance? Do they stagnate? Do they, there's all these ways that you can get people in the room or on the table, but do they actually have power? And those are the things that I weigh. So time will tell, and sometimes because of the nature of the inequities, you don't feel like you have time. But a lot of these systems require it to really make significant and sustainable change.
Can I just add really quick, Charles, to that?
Yeah, go for it.
I think that also, just connects to what we're seeing when organizations want to make that pivot to be diverse and inclusive. What Doug's alluding to is that it doesn't just happen overnight on the hiring end, but also on the end of developing a culture of inclusivity. In my mind, it took a long time to get to embed into structures and practices, gendered and racist practices. And so with diversity and inclusion, I don't want us to think of it as a light switch, but that there is a processing to it that has to be endured, so we really can get at the root of some of those structuralized and embedded notions that are leading to inclusivity.
Dr. Lapchick, you have been doing this, as Doug alluded to, for a number of decades now, right? And still a young man. But
that's 5 decades. That's all.
And so, over that time period, you've been involved in some pretty important movements internationally as well as nationally. Do you see a difference around kind of the moment that we're in now versus in previous moments, or has it always just been a performative response from these organizations, or are we starting to see those real work being done behind the scenes to create these inclusive environments?
I think because of what I said a little bit earlier, that athlete activism is now at play, that it's the most, especially in the 3 major men's sports, the 3 and the WNBA, the most diverse pool of employment in the country. And these are people who have substantial wealth at this point, that they can invest in movements that they're interested in. They have that voice. They know how to use their social platforms and direct it at important issues such as the ones we're talking about here. As I started to tell you that about being picked up at the airport when I go to college campuses, I forgot to tell the point I was trying to make, which is on the way back to the airport with the same person, after they've heard a little bit about my life and trusted me a little more, the conversation almost always is this: can you help me get out of here? They feel that people look at them that they were either hired because they were a woman or person of color, that they were promoted because they were a woman or person of color, or they feel they weren't promoted because they were a woman or person of color. And that's when I started talking about changing attitudes by diversity and inclusion training. That's so imperative for this to get people to buy in. I think the league offices themselves are doing pretty well now. All the major ones, it's at the team level where the senior positions, both for the sports ops as well as the business side, are overwhelmingly white men. The presidents, vice presidents. Now that Chaim's left, I would have mentioned earlier, the Red Sox, ironically, have the highest percentage of women vice presidents in Major League Baseball and have had it for years. They had the first Black woman who was a team vice president. But it's at that level that we have such a void, and where the pressure needs to be put on by the league office. I think they have to use that bully pulpit. And I think because the athletes are putting on that pressure now, it's going to add. I think in Adam Silver, we have probably the best advocate in my lifetime of somebody who's a commissioner who really gets diversity and inclusion. It's a principle. He knows that the league is going to be a better league when he threw the Clippers owner out of the league, out of ownership. He bought the players' confidence in themselves. They work together now. They're the only players association and league office that I think does work together so well, as opposed to Roger Goodell listening to the tape of the players on a Saturday night and making the statement that he made the next day, which I believed he was genuine. I didn't listen enough. I made a mistake and have to move ahead there. When you have diverse people around you to advise you like Adam does, you're going to make better decisions. The NFL was slower to get those people in place. Major League Baseball is slower also, but they're moving in those directions now. And I think that's going to make a qualitative difference at the club level if they use that bully pulpit and if the athletes especially exert the pressure that they are capable of exerting.
Thank you for that. And so, I'm gonna kind of like veer off a little bit here, because something that Ajhanai brought up earlier too is also, recognizing that when we're talking about a diverse workforce or diversity in these sport organizations, we have kind of honed in and focused on people of color and women. But there are a number of other identities out there in the kind of like the spectrum of humanity that also kind of function into, that can help create a diverse workforce. And so I recognize that kind of in this historical moment for the last year or so, race has been a predominant issue that we have been focusing on. But what about some of those other identities that individuals possess? And I've kind of an open question for everybody, what about, sort of the experience of having to navigate these organizations, or what does the space look like for individuals, who have different sexual orientations or have different physical abilities?
I mean, we work in that space. It's part of our training strong part of our training programs. But the reality is in men's sport today, as Doug knows, Billy Beane is the only Major League Baseball player to have come out, and he came out after he was retired. Jason Collins made the announcement about him being gay toward the end of his NBA career, and he was, hailed by the media and is now a hero not only in the LGBTQ community, but by progressive people in general, because he because he had that courage. So I think that we're still frail in our ability to welcome gay men into pro sports. I think for women it's significantly different, but we have a long way to go to make men feel safe and welcome, especially.
Ajhanai and Doug?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've seen most recently, there's a lot of coverage around what's happened, for example, with the Mets. And, they hired a couple of high-level executives and have all these problems with misogyny and just the way that they've engaged with the women around the game, whether media and beyond. And I know as a player, I've tried to pay as much attention around how you have this misogynistic environment, the celebration of maleness, right, in a dominant turbo male environment, very unwelcoming in those regards. And it's a similar necessity around the culture to be able, whether we talk about race or gender, there's a similar shift that's required to be able to embrace all people when you have a culture that is so much revolves around the sort of maleness, right, as defined by, and that creates a lot of problems, because you think back to, we covered this in my class with the Houston Astros when they had the sign stealing scandal. That was one thing, but before that, they had a very huge incident with the assistant general manager, who was sort of attacking a female reporter because she was critical of the trade that they made to bring in someone who had allegations and then beyond of domestic violence. And so when you mentioned, like, when you see these hires and then you ask yourself about the vetting process, and when they have these indicators and you say, how did this get missed? And then you read the story in the Athletic or wherever, and you see that there's all these indicators along the way from women who are saying that this was a problem back. They knew this from day one. So that goes back to this idea of the diversity of power. If they just paid attention to what people had been saying, what women had been saying early on, we wouldn't even made the hire, right? So you're at this high level of power, economic influence, cultural influence in sports. You'd think you'd have that more information about how to vet people. And I think, to me, that speaks to that lack of diversity in the room. So when you're talking about sexual orientation, to me, it comes back to the culture. And a lot of times that culture within the sport still allows certain things to continue. So, okay, all of a sudden now you have a bunch of guys, maybe black and white, but you still have this blind spot or this intentional focus where you're excluding people, and not only in a subtle way, but in almost a hostile way. So, you know, a lot of shift comes in. And so you have to, it's like Brenda Tracy is a big part of my class. You have to work with athletes with that culture to sort of express that you are sort of more than this is defined in this sort of maleness, and it can be these other things. I think when you break some of those barriers down, you can open up to many other types of people.
And I'll just briefly add that, you know, in my own work, when I am focused on gender and race, or the intersection of both identities, you know, my advancement of eliminating anti-Blackness in sport and in sport organizations is connected to the unique marginalizations of other ethnic groups and other disadvantaged senses of self. And so, although it may not seem like I'm explicitly talking about, you know, the unique experiences of those that are not able-bodied, that doesn't mean that my advancement of gender and race needs to be seen as devoid of their experiences. Coming from like a Black scholar perspective and how we study Black issues, it's that once we see advancement for the Black community historically and in society, we have seen that other communities have benefited. And so I know students ask all the time, you know, what about what's going on with X and X community? Extremely relevant and extremely important, but I don't want us to see that marginalization as not benefiting from when we address the marginalization of Black communities. And so that's just my perspective, that's the perspective I take in my work, but it doesn't mean that I'm ignoring other marginalizations. It just means the salience of what we're seeing gender and race in sport right now, we have to consider how we can push and advance that. And again, what both panelists have already alluded to, use the moment. And the moment right now is focused on eliminating anti-Blackness and gender issues, but that doesn't delimit the significance of other unique marginalizations. And so I hope that that makes sense.
I appreciate that. Dr. Lapchick, do you want to add to that?
I just wanted to say, following up on the last two discussions, is that we always make sure we have a woman called Anuka Brown address our students. Anuka Brown, if you don't know, was the senior African-American woman in professional sports. She was a senior vice president and EVP for the New York Knicks. And she sued the Knicks in the late 1900s for sexual harassment, and eventually won an $11 million lawsuit against the Knicks. And she was unemployable after that, but she had the courage to stand up. I called her Sports Anita Hill. And she's a powerful force. And it was only until Ward Manuel, who was an African-American athletic director at Buffalo, hired her, that she got a chance to come back into the world of sports and rose again because of Ward. But she literally risked everything to take a stand for women in general, because she knew that what happened to her was not unique. She was, you know, literally the senior African-American woman in sports. She knew what was happening to secretaries and administrative assistants with sports organizations around the country. Obviously, it's not limited to sports, but it's a problem in sports. And we want our sports management students who are going into that world to understand it and make sure that they're prepared to stop it.
Perfect. I want to follow up right away with you, Dr. Lapchick, there. You know, this tension, I think, that lies within the sport community about, you know, this pressure and desire to win, right? There is on these sport organizations, they need to win. And so we've already mentioned someone like Urban Meyer. You know, he has this 2 records, right? He has a record of winning on the field and bringing championships to a couple of different institutions or organizations that he's coached at. However, he also has this other record. You know, when he was at Florida, it was a bit of a, you know, a Wild West sort of mentality that was going on. There was little oversight, you know, condoning a number of different types of behaviors. We saw a similar sort of environment and culture being created at Ohio State, where he, you know, was knowingly employing individuals who were engaging in sort of those hostilities in their private life. You know, we now see him go down to Jacksonville, and he's hiring, you know, this former strength coach from Iowa who was let go because of his sort of racial hostilities and actions at Iowa, and now he brings them down to Jacksonville. And so I guess, you know, for those students, our students, and those who are going to go into the field, is what can they do to begin disrupting this tension that seems to exist? Well, we want someone who's going to win, but we, you know, recognizing that we need to start to diversify the field and then diversify that workforce and be, you know, problematize who we're idolizing in this field.
Well, I mean, we try to prepare them, our students, with the desire to win, the desire to have a great business, but also to have a business that makes decisions ethically, that makes judgments about race and gender that bring equity to the organization, that use, in particular, the power of sport for positive social change. I mean, we have such enormous leverage in the world of sports to do good in moments of tragedy, but also to move the needle, as was what we were alluding to earlier about athlete activism. That's you know, I had no intention of going back into academia to do it, but when I saw the opportunity to prepare this group of young students every year who would go out and hopefully change the industry so that the types of decisions you just mentioned about not even thinking about hiring Urban Meyer and what the consequences would be, you know, I don't think anybody who knew Urban Meyer was surprised with who we hired as the strength and conditioning coach. The pattern was there, as you laid out so clearly. We have to weigh those things as we make those decisions about who we hire, what they stand for, and where we're bringing the organization in the process.
Right. Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think, excuse me, one of the, you know, it's sometimes you have this challenge that, and I always talk about the charitable side of it, is that the thought that diversity is over here and winning and quality and being experienced is over here, like they're mutually exclusive somehow. And that's a narrative that really is important to change. And I do like how Major League Baseball tends to phrase it. They say, you know, we're not just, you know, charitably giving out positions to unqualified people. We're recognizing our blind spot and historic blind spot. And we're now getting better at identifying already qualified people that we overlooked because of our system and because of our bias. They are there. So I think you sometimes see these hires like, oh, we had to kick this guy. He's such a winner. There's a lot of people who can win. As Dr. Lapchick pointed out, look at the Tampa Bay Bucks. And sometimes, yes, the communities that have been disenfranchised know that already. They already know that there's talented people in all different stripes. But you do benefit from seeing a Super Bowl champ going up and seeing 6, you know, coaches of all these walks of life. That does matter. And maybe you see that the door may open a little bit more to say, okay, well, we can, you know, you broke that door down. It seems simple sometimes, but it actually makes a difference. But so I always go to that point of this idea. I heard it a lot, right? Oh, well, you know, we're hiring this, we're token giving this guy this job. And if we had Alex Cora on here, the Red Sox manager, he would say, like, I don't want to be your token. I don't want you to think that you're giving me this. Don't check the box. But then the idea is that if I'm hiring you, which we talked about how people don't get rehired if they don't do well right away, after being given bad teams anyway, they assume, oh, well, it was charity. So we just have to be mindful that is sort of the perspective a lot of times about diversity. And we have to continue to push back against that myth.
Awesome. Well, I want to encourage our audience to, again, use the chat box, the Q&A box to ask any questions for our panelists. One question that we've been asked a couple of times here is people are really looking for tangible strategies to take into an organization. And so I was going to kind of open question here. What are some of the tangible strategies that you would encourage individuals to take into the organizations as they advance?
I can go ahead and open up. This isn't a tangible strategy that I am suggesting coming from myself, Ajhanai, but this is a tangible strategy that I just want to acknowledge that the field is shifting to, the field of sport. And so we have seen not only this summer, but several years prior, the adoption of diversity leaders in sport organizations. And so, this position is still novel. We don't know much about the role, the structure. We're trying to make sense of that. That's what I'm trying to do with my scholarship. And so but what we can know about these positions for me is I'm drawing upon what we've seen in higher education with CDOs and what we know about senior women administrators in the NCAA model. And so what we know is I can pull an article on SWAs from 10 years ago, and the same experiences of marginalization, tokenization are being reported in 2020. And so what we understand about sometimes these positionalities that we think are going to shape organizational culture and lead to institutional change, it doesn't necessarily happen. We've had CDOs institutionalized for the past 20 years, but we can also look at higher education and still see where those gaps are. And so my suggestion to the field of sport broadly is, as we are beginning to see the adoption of these actual positions and not roles, how are we structuring the position? How are we thinking about what influence we want this position to have? What type of organization are they walking into, the same way that we've been talking about with coaches? What keys are they being handed? What are they being asked to fix? I mean, there's just so much into it. And so that's just been my big push as of late. And my push I'll continue to articulate and stand on is just that it's exciting, it's novel, it's creative, but we also have to pause and think about how are they leading, what are they changing, and what's the range of their leadership to actually be integral to shaping organizational culture around inclusivity.
I think the development of the position that Ajhanai is talking about is a new phenomenon for the most part. This week in my ethics class, we had the heads of diversity from all the major sports leagues as well as NASCAR, and they all had EVP or SVP designations except one who was a director. And I had to wonder about what authority that director was really going to have in their organization. Were they going to be able to move the needle? Ironically, when we started out the DeVos program in 2001, we were the first one to emphasize diversity as one of our major pillars. Now everybody says that they have this commitment to diversity. There are now 250 graduate programs in the country, but when we started out, people who were skeptical about our decision would be like, who's going to get employed in diversity? Well, now it's probably the most open position in the industry now, because a lot of teams, athletic departments, as well as all the league offices are having diversity officers, usually at a very high rank, but it's got to be at a high rank to make it really work.
Yeah, and adding to that, it's, power. It matters when you have diversity at the top and there's true input. That makes a difference. And you think about, a lot of times, you mentioned diversity and the programs being a relatively young industry in a sense, a young models that are been out there, but now are starting to coalesce in these organizational structures. It's sometimes hard without seeing exactly how the efficacy, right? You're trying to measure, okay, how are these doing? Because some people just slap the word diversity training on it, and that's right. And then, and in some ways you can create more enemies if you don't have the expertise. Or they could be just a rubber stamp, like, oh, we have this diversity officer, but they have no power to change anything. So I kind of go back to that power equation. One thing that tends to happen at times is, what's challenging about sports? Well, you have league offices that are trying to create policy, and you have these private kind of enterprises, right? These private enterprises that are kind of deep down saying, I want to hire who I want to hire, and that's that. I'm the billionaire owner of whatever. So you have to, policies is not enough, right? You need to like a shift, and as Dr. Lapchick talks about, that pressure coming from the players makes a big difference, because then your organizational as private as it can be, is still going to be held accountable and really see the service that they provide to the rest of the larger community because of what the image and what the culture of sports represent and reflect in our society. So I know that some of the loopholes, right, around diversity, as I just mentioned, the ceiling rule is in place, and then you had a run of 14 or 15 managers with zero experience, and none of them were of color, not a single one. And that was, kind of a way like, okay, we're going to do this, right? So, although the rule has worked at the, I guess the lower ranks, you have to watch those loopholes. And even unintentionally, sometimes there's people who want to get the answer that they want and who they hire will find it. And so it takes vigilance.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of circle back to what Ajhanai and Dr. Lapchick were discussing too, is that we're seeing the adoption of these chief diversity officer roles or positions in organizations. But Dr. Lapchick, you're also saying that, are they being structurally set up to succeed, or is it going to be sort of like a lame duck position where they're not going to have the power or the authority? And so I guess in your experiences, whoever wants to jump in here first, has that been what we're seeing? Is a bit of a lame duck position with no real power or authority to actually implement change or to engage in sort of structural conversations about what is happening, or are they being empowered to build a more inclusive culture?
I think I've seen hires at Major League Baseball and the NFL of multiple layers in their diversity and inclusion offices and efforts that indicate that they are moving beyond having just somebody there. I think that the two best examples that I can share with everybody from my perspective of the benefits of diversity and inclusion are the two commissioners in the NBA and the NFL. When the Ray Rice story was going on in the NFL, I think the NFL has the best public relations machine in the business, but Roger Goodell couldn't possibly have handled it any worse from my point of view. A two-game suspension at first. That when the first video came out, a 6-game suspension. When the second video came out, Roger Goodell did not have a single senior woman administrator in the NFL league office and not many on the teams. And so the league kind of bumbled along. Somebody could have said early on, Roger, take this as your issue. We've had 54 NFL players accused of gender violence in the 9 years you've been here. During that period of time, 9 million American women were raped, 11 million were battered. This is a problem of men in America. Our NFL teams are going to commit to every community they're in to support domestic violence prevention programs, and made it into something proactive, but he didn't. NBA, almost the same time, Adam Silver is taking over for the most probably legendary commissioner in the history of pro sports, David Stern. 3 months into it, the tape leaks on a Friday night of the Clippers owner making racist statements. And Adam Silver had an office loaded with people of color and women in senior administrative positions. And on Tuesday, when he took that podium, I don't think anybody expected him to say, because it had never happened in any professional sport, we're removing an owner from ownership because we have no room for racists in this league. It was the most important statement by a commissioner that I've ever heard in my lifetime. And I think it was because who he had advising them.
I'll just briefly add, so I know we can get to maybe a couple of questions, is that I can't wholeheartedly answer your question yet, as I'm still trying to study what is the substantive or symbolic nature of the positions. But I will say, something we all should remain curious about in regards to what I call ADIOs, Athletic Diversity and Inclusion Officers, is their agency. What is their agency with the resources that they're given? What is their agency, particularly in collegiate athletics, to the athletic director, maybe even the president or the campus-wide CDO? How agentic do they perceive themselves? And so, again, I just think there's a range of different questions that I would love to say, yes, Charles, it's symbolic, but I just can't at the moment. So wait till the latter half of 2021 where I can give a more truthful answer.
Thank you. We'll just have time for one more question before we wrap it up here. And, I think it's been mentioned tonight, but it is often cited, is the Rooney Rule. And so we have this league-wide policy in the NFL trying to encourage, individuals, at least interviewing someone from a minority background. It hasn't necessarily panned out the way that the NFL has wanted it to, but is there other policies that could work or that could help facilitate diversifying candidate pools or helping to, push forward inclusive organizations from those league offices onto the teams and organizations across leagues?
Well, the Rooney Rule, when it started, only called for a single candidate of color to be represented in the search process. I think studies have come out since then that make it clear that unless you have at least two candidates of color or two women in the room, depending on what the position is, of course, it's unlikely that you're going to choose a diverse candidate to be the person selected in that process. So that has to be factored in. If I'm a college, being recruited to a college, I think I would make a more informed decision if colleges and universities where it was mandated that they had to give me as a recruit a breakdown of not only the graduation rates of student athletes, but that broken down by race, because there's a significant gap between the graduation rate of African-American and white student athletes on some teams, as well as who's hired as head coaches, what percentage of the women's teams are coached by women, which percentage of all teams are coached by people of color, what percentage of the senior people on staff are women and people of color. If I know that and my parents know that, I'm going to make a better choice into where I'm going to go. I might feel more comfortable. And I think that would make athletic departments look inward as well. But again, for me, the key is athlete activism.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think about the Sealy rule in baseball, which has that sort of same intent. And I guess the lessons from that remind me of probably something universal about these policies. There are loopholes and there's workarounds. Now, if people and organizations are committed, they won't see that as an exit ramp. But for example, with the Sealy rule, there's another way. As I mentioned, it's become a lateral hire more than it used to be a pipeline hire. And the lateral is a grooming mechanism where you create almost an apprenticeship, and they're kind of handpicked. So if you're the Colorado Rockies, you're out in Denver, you say, okay, this is a managerial candidate. You bring them under your umbrella, you train them, and then they move laterally, like David Ross did in Chicago. And so that lateral move, if you have the Sealy rule, you say, oh, you have to interview minority candidates, but one candidate's on this apprenticeship, who has the advantage? And those are often special assistants. You hear that term a lot, special assistants to the GM. Well, those special assistants have inside tracks. And that is sort of a workaround on the Sealy rule, because even though you're bringing in these minority candidates or diverse candidates, this person just has an advantage because they've been kind of handpicked. So you got to have, really either, close those loopholes to a certain degree, or at least point them out and showcase it. So these organizations really think more deliberately about, and as you mentioned, AJ, like the idea of like, well, why are you kind of finding these workarounds? I think that's important to understand. So the Sealy rule, is one of those examples that policy is not everything, and you have to think about the next iteration when you're making this iteration.
Chaim, thanks for rejoining us. I was about to close out here, but I'll repose the last question for you, just in case you want to add anything. But we're just discussing things like the Sealy rule, the Rooney rule. What sort of policies would you like to see either at a league-wide level brought in to kind of help facilitate and encourage organizations to create more inclusive environments?
I think the league obviously can always do more. I think they've done a lot. I really think a lot of the onus is on us now as individual organizations to come up with our own policies to further that. There's only so much the league can do, and there is more. I do think, and I think the league has, in baseball, done a better job. Initially, a lot of the focus was on, GMs and managers and positions like that. And a lot of it's about the pipeline, and the league has done a really good job in recent years making sure that there is equal access to that pipeline. and that clubs have no excuse, that no club can ever sit there and say, well, we can't find the right people, that the league has done a great job sourcing candidates. But like I said, I think it's in our hands. We can't put this on the league. We got to take care of our own organizations. We should be competing on this just like we compete on everything we do to try to be the best in this area. And, you know, that's something that we should all, I believe in any sport, any organization should be able to get into this. We're competitors. So let's compete at this. We know we have a ways to go. Let's see how quickly we can get better. And what that means is going to be different for every organization. I think, frankly, a lot of it starts with empowering and listening to people who don't look like me, because we haven't done that as a sport very well. But, you know, there's no reason that we shouldn't be competing to outdo each other in this area, just like we do in everything else.
Thank you, Dr. Lapchick, Chaim, Doug, and Ajhanai for being here tonight and having this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you to all of our guests who came on and participated in the Q&A, as well as just listened in. Also, lastly, I'd just like to thank the UConn Human Rights Institute, or the Dodd Center, as well as the Neag School of Education and the UConn Sport Management Program. So thank you all for your continued support of Beyond the Field. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm just going to close out now. So thank you, Doug. Have a good night. Nana, Eleanor, thank you.